All right. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chad Cook. I'm part of the ForceNET team. I'm one of the principal investigators along with Bill Reed. And we also have Greg Khalsa, Don Elliott, Vitaly Napadao. And I see Greg and Don here right now. In a minute, I'll be introducing our speaker, who is a legend from NIH, Dr. Partap Khalsa. But first, I want to give a few ground rules with respect to the webinar. For starters, please stay muted throughout. It just keeps the distractions at a minimum. We appreciate that greatly. We will have question and answers. You can actually post your question in the chat bar, and I will moderate that. So I'll pull those questions out. You can post those throughout the presentation if you'd like. And I can, Dr. Khalsa has already given permission to, for if it's a clarification question, that we can pose that through the presentation, but most of the question and answers will be at the end, and there'll be a lengthy question and answer period at the end. So I think you'll have a good opportunity to interact. Lastly, if you haven't had a chance to join ForceNET, we would welcome you to go to our website. We'll put you on a mailing list. By the way, it's free to join. You will receive additional information about upcoming webinars. We have several coming, about our pilot grants, and we just posted a new RFA for that. And in the future, training materials for researchers. All right, I have the extreme pleasure to introduce Dr. Partap Khalsa as our speaker today in our webinar. Dr. Khalsa is a clinician scientist who has a doctorate of chiropractic degree from Los Angeles College of Chiropractic. He also has a PhD in biomedical sciences from Worcester Polytech Institute and University of Massachusetts Medical School. Dr. Khalsa just retired in 2022 from NIH, where he was the director of the Division of Extramural Activities from 2017 to 2022. But he's been involved with the National Center of Complementary and Integrated Health, or NCCIH, within the NIH since 2006. And then prior to joining NIH, Dr. Khalsa was a successful academician from the Department of Biomedical Engineering at State University in New York at Stony Brook, and was also the founder and director of 2 chiropractic clinics in Massachusetts. So when you prepare to give an introduction of a talk like this, you get to read somebody's CV. And it was astonishing, the amount of information that was on a CV. I could not do it justice to actually go through the many impressive accolades of Dr. Khalsa's career. So in a situation like that, I typically ask a peer or a colleague, how would you describe this person's impact? And I would like to give you that now. Dr. Khalsa was at the helm when NCCH got real. He has been the face of the franchise. He leaves big shoes for others to fill. He understands complementary and integrative medicine like nobody before or since. And I know everyone appreciated his enthusiasm and leadership moving NCCIH forward. As I mentioned, we're extremely fortunate to have Dr. Partap Khalsa as our webinar speaker. Dr. Khalsa, it's all yours. Thank you very much.
Okay. So I just wanted to first thank the organizers of ForceNET, really, for the invitation to present. And particularly, I want to shout out to Greg Khalsa and Bill Reed, who both actually suggested the topic of this what I'm actually going to talk on. I was actually going to talk on something entirely different, but Craig and Bill basically insisted that I talk on this particular topic, and I'm delighted to do so. And it's essentially, I wanted to take a little bit, go behind the curtains on certain key aspects of how NIH actually makes awards and how it affects whether you're going to actually get an award as well. So I'm going to jump into this, and if there are, again, clarifying questions that anyone wants to ask, please go ahead and put them in the chat, and Dr. Cook will let me know of those, and then we should have plenty of time to talk about any of what I'm actually presenting and anything else that comes up. So the take-home message for this presentation really is the interaction between what's called Select Pay by NIH and its role in funding your application, and the key things that you want to be doing in your application to leverage what NIH calls select pay. On the screen here are a handful of bullets. These are sort of the key messages, but they're all interrelated to this concept of NIH select pay, and which I'm going to explain it all. And this is really about the different audiences that read your application and make decisions about whether it's going to be funded. So in particular, there are 5 different audiences, at least from my perspective, that will play to this, and I'm going to describe each of those different audiences for you. And so you really want to be knowing that there are these different audiences and writing your application so that you address the things that those audiences have. One of the big aspects of this is really focusing in your application about the impact. And I'm going to talk about what is impact, both for the scientific field and if it's relevant for healthcare policy. One of the other key things that's related to this is about articulating the foundation for your proposal. And by foundation, I mean the research that was done prior to really setting up the proposal that you're going to be doing. It's not necessarily your own research, it's the key findings in the field that are germane to your proposal. And then to be describing what needs to be known to advance the field. And I think this is particularly key for the whole force-based manipulations initiative, because the whole reason that this got funded by NIH was that there's a lot that needs to be known to be able to advance the field, right? There's a lot of clinical studies that all show that force-based manipulations have benefit, but on average, that benefit tends to be modest, maybe to moderate. And part of the reasons we aren't able to move beyond that really has to do with lack of understanding or insufficient understanding of the mechanisms involved with which force-based manipulations have their effects. And so that's sort of why this particular initiative is so key, I think. And the last thing is targeting the mission of a given institute or center and its scientific priorities. This sounds like just sort of a throwaway. It's actually critical, and I will explain why in the presentation. So before I go into what I'm going to be saying, I want to just remind everyone that the NIH website has enormous volume of information about the grant process, writing applications, and all these different things. There are slides, there are videos, there are links to grant seminars that NIH puts on for free for investigators. And I think it's really a great opportunity. If you haven't ever gone to that, and I've put here the homepage of this grants and funding, I strongly recommend that you look at it. If you're a seasoned investigator, know all this stuff, it still might be for a given application worthwhile to go and check it out, sort of remind yourself of some of the aspects on it. And in addition, most of the NIH institutes and centers that make awards also have information on their own individual websites about the grant process, and some that's specific to their own institute. So again, a wealth of information there. It's all free, and most of it's pretty good. So I think many of you have seen a graphic that looks something like this, talking about the NIH grant cycle, where you have this sort of going around this circle of various things that happen. This particular graphic is set up so that it's divided. There's a top half to it where the green is representing the principal investigator. This light blue is about the institute. So you, the principal investigator, come up with your ideas, you write your grant application, you hand it off to your institution who submits it. And hopefully on the other side of this, you get the money and you are able to do the research. And there's also this other side of this is talking about, well, what does NIH do to try to make a decision about whether to fund your application? And this is pretty generic. What I'm going to show you is sort of focusing on this NIH side, and specifically what goes on between when your application goes into the scientific peer review and the decision process that actually gets made. So what happens between peer review and award? And this is where this select pay concept really takes force, because there's a lot that goes on between getting your score and getting an award that can push your application one way or to other, that is getting an award or not. I think most of you have also seen this sort of idea of the NIH dual level review system, where again, you have a scientific review group that assesses your application. They score it. There's a summary statement with written comments that goes to the national advisory councils, who do their own thing, and then it goes to the institute director. So this is all pretty well understood. What is not real clear to a lot of people is what happens between each of these sort of rectangles here. What happens between the review group and the advisory council, and between the advisory council to the institute director. And this is where this concept of NIH select pay goes on, because there's an awful lot that goes on between each of these steps that has a direct effect upon whether you actually get an award on your application. So what is select pay? The federal policy and NIH policy is that NIH institutions award applications that are grouped together, so they're like applications, for example, all the R01 applications in score order. So that's policy, right? That's the default scenario. And of course, the score is determined by this independent scientific peer review. These are literally your scientific peers, not NIH staff, who determine the score. And this is really all about scientific merit. But it is certainly possible for applications that don't get funded in score order. And when that happens, the program staff have to write up a programmatic justification, which literally gets put into the official grant file, which you don't have access to, but it is there, and it's part of the auditing process by NIH. And the key point here is that the priority score, or the percentile, is not the only thing that determines whether you get an award. And this is where select pay comes in. So this is the data slide, and the one data slide I'm going to actually show you. And these are data on funding patterns. This particular slide is for all of NIH for fiscal year 2022. So you take all the institutes and centers combined, you put them in here. On the vertical axis, if I'll orient you here, the vertical axis is the applications or awards going from 0 up to 400. And on the horizontal axis are the percentiles from 1 to into the 60s. And if you're not familiar with NIH, having a low score is what you want. That means you're in the higher percentile. These data are for all R01 applications or R01 equivalent applications. And the light blue color are R01 applications that got awarded. And in this sort of yellowish brown color is for applications that did not get awarded. And what you can see is the ones that have the lowest percentiles are the ones that are getting awarded, and the ones with the highest percentiles are not getting awarded. And there's this area in the middle here where there's a considerable overlap. And what you see if you follow these blue bars here, as you go down in here, that you see these are ones that are typically out of any funding zone, but you see them going into the 30s, and there's even a few onesie twosies kind of things up into the 40th percentile, and even occasionally into a 50th percentile that get awarded. And conversely, you see applications, these are the yellow bars, that down here in the single digit percentiles, and a first percentile, it doesn't get any better. You cannot get a better score than a first percentile that don't get awarded. And this is what is called at NIH select pay. And so the question is, how does that happen? Policy is you pay in score order. Here are ones that are clearly within the funding zone that aren't getting awarded, and you have ones that are outside the funding zones that are getting awarded. How does that happen and why? And so that's what we're going to be talking about, or I'm going to be talking about. So there are, as I mentioned before, there are a series of audiences that determine this. And they're specifically, I'm going to talk about 5 different audiences. The first is peer review, and this is clearly a really critical one. As I mentioned before, these review panels are convened by, but are independent of NIH. They are literally your scientific peers. NIH just does the convening and sets up the meeting and takes notes on it. But the assessment and the scoring is done by your peers, scientific peers, and their comments are all put into the summary statement. If your application is discussed by the panel, and roughly half of them are, then there's a resume of that oral discussion is also included in the summary statement. It's usually right at the top. And just so that everyone here know we're all on the same page, Each reviewer provides their own overall priority / impact score. Then all the panel, those individual scores get averaged. And then that average gets multiplied by 10. And that literally is the final score that's provided on the summary statement. For some review panels, and particularly chartered study sections that meet regularly, the final scores are converted to percentiles. And the percentiles essentially are just normalizing the scoring behavior of a given panel over 2 to 3 past meetings. And the final score or percentile is a major determinant of whether an application will be awarded. So knowing that, obviously, and this is nothing new, I think, to most of you, you want to really be crafting your application for the peer review panel. But the key thing is that they are being asked at the end of the day, but when they give the score, is all about impact. That's what that overall score is all about. There are all these different components that make it, but it's really about their assessment of impact. So you want to be a savvy investigator. You want to be telling and showing them how and why your proposed research is actually going to be impactful. That's where you get into the need to articulate the foundation. What are the prior studies that really are setting up the foundation for your proposed research? And what questions need to be answered? That's what you're doing, right? So you want to be describing how the proposed study would be conducted so that you can answer those questions, and why answering those questions would have high impact. That is, why would it significantly advance the field to do this study, right? That's what it's all about from peer review. Now, your second audience is really the program directors. So after the summary statement is written and issued, the program directors who are assigned to each of the individual applications, they look at those summary statements. And in many cases, they may have even actually attended the meeting and have notes from the meeting as well. And the reason that they do that is that they are going to be doing a separate assessment. It's not a re-review of the science for scientific merit. It is a programmatic assessment. And they're going to be assessing factors that are not available. I want to just repeat that. They're assessing factors that are not available to the peer reviewers. And there are a range of these things. I've listed 4 major ones on the screen here that I'll briefly talk about there, but there are some additional things as well. But the first key one is how relevant is the proposed research to the mission and scientific priorities of the institute or center that is potentially going to be funding this. And clearly you want it to be of highly relevant and high priority. They were going to be assessing whether the proposed study would be duplicative or very similar to other funded studies by NIH, including by other institutes within NIH and other federal, state, or private agencies, for example. So there's databases that the program directors have access to, which enables them to go in and put in the relative terms and check to see whether there are other studies that are basically similar to this in the Veterans Health Administration or the Department of Defense or various other state and private agencies, because NIH is not very interested in simply duplicating studies that are ongoing are being funded by other agencies. Another thing that they're looking at to assess programmatic impact is, do the investigators and/or their institutions have other studies that would compete for the same or similar study populations? Now, this is more relevant for clinical studies using humans, but on rare occasions, it also includes certain animal studies where there are unusual species being used for which there's a limited population. And so there might, if you have a larger institution that might have, for example, 2 or 3 other studies that are all looking at or trying to recruit patients with, say, back pain or neck pain or some joint disorder or whatever it is, and you're got a study here that's highly meritorious, it's relevant, but the question is, can you actually get those patients or participants to actually be into the study? So it's a key thing, and if you can't, or there's a question about that, that lowers the programmatic impact. Another one is that the program directors assess is whether the investigators and/or their institutions have a history of not meeting participant accruals, or they're not meeting the timelines or publishing in a timely manner the results of their prior funded studies. So these are all just examples of the kinds of things that program directors systematically assess on every application that they are looking at for potential funding. And it all goes into what is the programmatic impact. Now, again, not the scientific merit of the application, but of the programmatic impact. So this is your second audience. And what you can do about it is that some of the aforementioned issues could be included in relevant sections of the application. For example, you could talk about in your application your success at meeting accrual targets in prior studies, the timely publication of your research results from prior grants, and et cetera. After the summary statement is issued, once you've read it yourself, you can contact the program officer who's assigned to your grant application and provide them additional relevant information about your research. So for example, you could talk about the reviewer's critiques and how you could address some of the issues, assuming you agree with the critiques. If you don't agree with the critiques, you could try to rebut them in written comments to with the program officer. Now, you don't just send that out, but you want to have a discussion, email exchange with the program officer about this. But that's something you can do to affect then how the programmatic impact is going to be assessed. Program officers meet regularly with their colleagues, other program officers in their branch or division at a given institute to discuss these pending applications. And they, as a group, will then be seeing whether they can directly address whether a given action would actually be impactful from a programmatic perspective. So you want to make sure in your application that you're giving them something to talk about. Don't leave them hanging there. Your third audience really is the National Advisory Council. Their principal role in terms of the grant process is really about oversight of the initial scientific peer review, but they also vote to concur or not on the proposed applications and other types of recommendations that they could make. Prior to a given meeting of the council, and it's worth just reminding everyone that every institute and center that makes awards has its own individual National Advisory Council. And the members of that council then are provided a list of all the applications that were scored, and that's so that essentially it excludes the ones that were quote unquote not discussed applications, as well as the summary statements for those applications. Now, again, as policy, the applications are funded in score or percentile order, but in the closed session of council, again, and closed session simply means that the public is not allowed in that. It is literally the council members, senior staff of the given institute, and other relevant staff from a given institute, but even not all the people of a given institute come to closed session. And their collective task is to determine whether the scientific peer review was performed in compliance with NIH policy and whether the applications that are under consideration for funding are relevant to the mission of the institute. Now, the council does not re-review the applications for scientific merit. They're really looking at sort of a more of a 50,000-foot level, but it's this area where you now have applications that are maybe in the middle of whether they should be funded or not, and this is going to be a discussion that happens during those closed sessions. Now, most of the applications that come in for a given council round, there's nothing that they essentially get processed by a process called en bloc concurrence. It's sort of routine processing. There's no discussion, nor needs to be. Everything's happening the way it's supposed to be happening. But there are applications that need special actions. And this is not a bad thing or something because someone did something wrong, but it's for certain types of cases where it needs certain special attention and a special vote and consideration by council. So for example, most institutes, when they have applications coming in that were submitted in response to requests for applications, RFAs, where there were funds that were set aside specifically for that request for applications, they go through a special action where the staff usually will present to council the applications that were, again, in score order and anything that was out of score order that's under consideration. And this is where, in particular, this area down here of high program and low program priority comes into play, because if you have applications that were outside the typical funding range or outside of score order, but are compelling in terms of the research priority, there's an unmet area that this application is directly addressing, then it can be nominated for high program priority, in which case it sort of moves up in terms of its possibility of funding. And the inverse of that is low program priority, where applications may be highly scientifically judged to be highly scientifically meritorious, but have very low relevance to the mission of a given institute and or its research priorities. And this essentially lowers it in terms of whether it might be funded. So these areas are precisely in terms of this area what NIH calls select pay. These nominations can come from either council members or from staff, the NIH staff. So knowing this, again, this is the reason why it's so important to be targeting an institute for its mission and its research priorities. You can submit an application without targeting it and without even consideration of what are research priorities of a given institute. But if you're in so doing, you may be missing out on this area where it becomes really critical and where you have a whole group of people who that's their job, is to try to say, well, is this mission relevant? And is it a high research priority? Now, the fourth audience is related to what we call funds available. And at first glance, you might say, well, why is this a mystery? Doesn't NIH have calculators? Doesn't it know how much money it's gotten? And can it figure out how much money is available, kind of thing? And the answer is it's a little more complicated than that. Essentially, what happens is that either prior or shortly after a given councilman staff will determine what funds are available for competing applications for a given round of council. These are the new applications coming in. But in a given fiscal year, it's the non-competing grants that are the biggest budget expenditure by far, right? So these are grants that were made from a prior council round or even a prior fiscal year, but have out years. And so they have budget implications for NIH. And so if there are any unanticipated changes to the non-competing grants, this can affect the funds available for competing grants. In addition, you have some applications coming into RFAs, which again have set-asides, and so they are less affected by the vagaries of the non-competing grants, but the majority of applications that come in are coming in and they're competing for the general pool of funds for a given institute or center. And so for a given council round, there may be more or less good scoring applications of a given budget category, and this may also affect the availability of funds for a given category of types of grants. So this is the background here, and the audience where this plays into are the committee that's responsible for looking into this for each institute and center. They have a committee that meets regularly to discuss their options of what to fund and its immediate impacts, that is in the given fiscal year, and its long-range budgetary impacts. These are for the out years, typically up to 5 years, or another 4 years beyond the current. And the people who comprise those committee are usually senior staff. So it includes the budget officer, the grants management officer, the division directors, deputy director, some program staff. And the discussions that happen on these meetings, and they typically meet a couple of times a month, sometimes more frequently, depending upon what's going on. But the key is, one of the key things that they're talking about is the programmatic impact. That is the assessment by program staff of the impact of this funding, this award, on its overall portfolio of grants. And this is why, again, you want to make sure that you're addressing the needs that program staff, how they assess programmatic impact. They also look at things like, is co-funding needed from other NIH institutes to actually make this award? And then there's some very pragmatic issues around just-in-time information. Just-in-time, I think most people know, after the application goes through peer review, it gets scored. You will get notified if certain just-in-time information is needed. This depends on the nature of the grant, but it can include product integrity plans, data safety monitoring plans, subject accrual retention plans, modifications to specific aims if it's so indicated by program staff, and a number of other things as well. That information is critical to actually making awards. And if it doesn't come in time, then you may miss, and there's a window of time that your application is actually considered for actual awards, then you can miss the funding of your application, not because of scientific merit or even programmatic assessment, but simply because they don't have the information needed to make the award. And if this happens towards the end of the fiscal year, your grant can actually, it doesn't get funded that year. It may be carried over into the next fiscal year, but now it has to recompete against new applications that are coming in. So it's a really critical thing. It's a very pragmatic, mundane thing, but if it doesn't happen, then you lose your shot at the funds that are available for your award. And the fifth audience really is the institute or center director. They are legally the only person who has the authority to approve funding, and they have to approve the funding for every grant application made by their institute or center. So what happens here is that subsequent to a given council round and discussions by staff about programmatic assessment, they'll put together one or more pay plans for the grant applications to go to the IC director for their approval. And that pay plan has to get routed through a group of people. It varies by institute, but it's typically anywhere from 4 to 8 people. And it typically includes the programmatic division director, the budget officer, the grants management officer, the deputy director of the institute, the DEA director, and all of them who look at different aspects of all these grants just to make sure that everything's checked off that needs to be checked off to make the award. And so when that finally arrives on the institute director's desk, as it were, a virtual desk, their computer these days, the issue is that all the IC directors are all scientists. And as all scientists do, they have opinions about what science may be impactful. And so the question is, from your perspective that you want to know is, how do you know what the IC director considers to be impactful research or priority of research? And that's where it all comes down to the Institute's strategic plan, which is posted on the Institute's website. And it generally reflects the research priorities of the Institute director, or at least the approval of the director of certain research priorities. So this is why in your application, you want to make sure you have articulated concisely but compellingly how it's relevant to the priorities of the Institute and relevant to the Institute's strategic plan. So I'm going to come back to this data slide, which I showed you in the very beginning, again about select pay, because it's these 5 audiences that I just talked about that are going to determine whether your application gets to be a blue bar in NIH's what actually got awarded, or it is going to be one of these yellowish brown bars where it didn't get awarded. Even if it got a great score, it might not have got awarded, or the other way around, it didn't get such a great score, but it still gets awarded because you've done the things, particularly in your application, to be able to assist staff in making sure that they really want this application, even if it didn't get the greatest scientific score. So that's what's select pay, how it affects whether you get something funded or not in an application, and what happens behind the curtains in making those decisions. So that's the end of my prepared remarks. We're up for questions and comments.
That was fantastic. And I know that the questions are going to come pouring in. We do have 2. Let me just remind our audience, pose your questions in the chat. We'll stay muted as we go along, and I'll consolidate those questions. The first one is, your slides are incredibly valuable. If you're willing to share those, we can talk offline and then possibly connect those to the video. I know we're recording this as well.
Sure.
So folks, keep an eye on our website. We'll have it posted if we can share those slides. The second question is actually from Jason Benachek. It says, how important is it that your grant ends up in the right study section? Sometimes your grant ends up in a different section that you did not request. Can you give us the background on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And obviously, if it for some reason it ends up in the study section where the topic of your grant application is sort of an outlier, then it's possible. So the challenge here is that, all right, so let me back up. So the answer is maybe. It matters. It may matter a lot, and it may matter a little, depending upon what happens. So when you have it goes to gets assigned to a study section or a special emphasis panel, some review group. In chartered study sections, they routinely will bring in ad hoc reviewers, which they bring in because they needed certain expertise on one or more applications that the regular members of the study section don't have. But they can only bring in so many in a given round. And the question is whether the reviewers, the regular members of the reviewers, understand the science as well as you would like it to be understood. And that's where how well you write your application comes in. If you write your application so that only a handful of people in the world could understand it, that may be problematic particularly if you get that the handful of the people who understand it aren't in the study section. On the other hand, if you write the application so that scientists who have a reasonable understanding of the general field, can understand what you're talking about, and particularly this question about how is it impactful scientifically, then it probably will matter less. So it depends both on the nature of the study section and how you write your application. I won't say how well, but how you craft it so that people who are not necessarily the 5 people who understand down to the greatest detail. I'll share with you, there's an ongoing debate within NIH about the composition of review groups. And the debate is precisely, or is sort of the analog of the question you just posed. And it's about how many reviewers with specific expertise that on your proposal need to be in a study section. And the debate is whether you actually are better served by having generalists on this panel versus people who are highly expert in the area that your proposal is in. And it's a debate because people have different opinions. Some people say, oh, well, you really want to have the scientists who really understand this area so that because they'll appreciate it and they'll understand it and they'll give me a good score because they understand it. And the other side of the coin is that same phenomenon is also associated with them nitpicking you on methodology, and that generalists won't be as nitpicking about it. They'll be looking at more of things related to how impactful it's going to be in terms of scientific field. And so it's still a sort of a challenge to find the happy medium between having some people who are great, the most accomplished scientists in the world in that very specific area that your application is addressing, versus people who are generals, because their votes all count the same, right? Just because the given panel will have typically anywhere between a low of maybe 15 people up to 30 people on a given panel, and everyone's vote only counts once. Now, it may also be the case that someone can convince others by force of their arguments, but it is a real debate.
Thank you for that. Our own Dawn Elliott asks, after peer review, you mentioned an audience that looks at the PI and the university's success or responsiveness in the past. What kind of things are documented and carried forward?
So for investigators who have, so this is where it's a little bit of an art, because it's not like there's a file kept that says, oh, well, they're really timely and someone else is not, or that someone had, there's a clear documentation of, oh, they didn't recruit, they didn't meet their timelines. But within an institute, certainly it is the case that the program staff, that's one of the things their job is to understand their own portfolio and to know the investigators and to look to see whether they perform well on prior awards, certainly from their own institute or center. And in many cases, they will reach out to, if there's their investigator, they don't know them that well, but they've had prior funding from other institutes within NIH. They will reach out to their colleagues from those other institutes and just ask them, how did they perform well on this? Some of it you can also look. I mean, you can look and say, oh, when did the grant end? When did the main publication come out? And, was it 6 months, a year, 6 years? So some of it's just you have to do a little bit of digging and it's clear. Others you have to sort of do more deeper digging for it. It's the same thing within institutions. They develop reputations about how well as an institution are they performing. And I think everyone's aware that there have been cases where a whole institution can get, paused on its funding because of bad conduct by a single laboratory or a single study. Those are rare, but they can happen. And, so they get, there is knowledge that gets developed, a history, if you will, about these factors. So it is something that is really assessed by program staff.
So I have a follow-up question to that before we get to Greg's question.
Sure.
How important are facilities pages or where you tout the benefits of the institution, or is it more of the behind the scenes evaluation of that institution that takes place?
I think it's both, actually. So certainly reviewers will, they look at that because they're going to be saying, can these guys really pull off, do they have the stuff? Do they literally have the environment and the equipment and resources to do whatever the proposed study is? NIH staff, and particularly program directors, will also look at this, again, post-review, once the summary statement is available, to say, yeah, we also think they've got the stuff, right? So they want to make sure as well. So it really is something that gets paid attention to.
So we've got a great question by Greg here. It says, how are target missions, priorities, and special interests of NCCIH determined? Is there a consultation with the public, scientists, or clinicians? Where do the U24s play a role?
Greg, can you augment that a little bit?
Yeah, Partap, I guess, there are these special interests or priority focuses. Does this come up at lunch and everyone decides on a Friday, or,
Yeah.
where does this information come from? How is it vetted? What gets thrown away? Just a little bit of a further pull of the curtain to glimpse.
Yeah. Well, actually, in general, this is actually a really in-depth process that these sort of initiatives, like the force-based manipulations initiative, for which ForceNET is one of the awarded networks, these are typically multi-year processes that a given institute or institutes will be involved with. And so it's not just something that happens with lunch. You get together with a couple of buddies and you say, hey, this is a great idea, let's do it. And then it happens. There's a formal process. Again, at most institutes, there's variations of how institutes do this. But there's a formal process that typically involves discussions by staff of wherever the idea originated from. I'll share with you, and I think many of you probably are aware of, about, how long ago was it now? 3 or 4 years ago, a few of you were on this call, I know were there. There was a invitation-only workshop that was a multi-day, at least 2-day workshop that NCCIH, along with NINDS, and I think 1 or 2 other institutes, convened to talk about, what do we need to know? What is needed to sort of make significant advancement of the field related to force-based manipulations. And that's pretty typical at NIH, to bring together a bunch of water walkers, as we call them, or at least NIH may still use that term, who, really the experts in the field, bring them together, lock them in a room kind of thing, and don't let them out until they give us the answer of where should we go. So that's a kind of thing of getting input from experts in the field. It can also come from other sources. I mean, and council can raise things up, the public can raise things up. It also happens sometimes in a much quicker timeline when there are really public health emergencies like COVID-19. This went into NIH, got turned on a dime, which is something it rarely ever does, and just shifted and put massive resources into trying to deal with this public health emergency. But most of the ideas go through a more considered process where you really get a lot of input from people. And staff will have multiple discussions on this at various levels. It gets presented at multiple meetings over a period of time. And then once an institute thinks this is really a good idea, they will bring the concept of the idea of whatever the initiative is going to be, to their advisory council. And these are presented in open session. And in that open session, they will literally present concepts, which are things that have been a lot of thought and input have been already put into. And then the council will have its opportunity to weigh in, whether and will take a vote of whether they approve it as presented or not, needs to go back to the drawing board. And once it is, then that's when the initiatives start to get written to go out for the idea. So the force-based manipulation is just an example of that. So it's usually most cases, it's a lot of thought and input, comes from, in some cases, from a variety of sources. The whole idea of, from force-based manipulations, again, NCCIH really was taking the lead on that, and has for a number of decades now doing research or funding research on force-based manipulations of various sorts, and both mechanistic and clinical studies. And it sort of is, there are some other institutes at NIH, and there are other agencies outside of NIH that have also funded these researches as well, in other countries as well. But I think NCCIH really got to the point probably 4 or 5 years ago that it's saying, we're seeing some benefit here, but what is it going to take to really move the field forward and to make significant advances, right? Not just one-offs, but things that would really move it forward. And I think the decision was, we still don't understand well enough the mechanisms by which these force-based manipulations actually have their effects. And we see the range of effects is so vast, right? From nothing in case, and really worst cases, it makes people worse, to people who really, get cured after a single treatment kind of thing. And so but I think, as most clinicians know, it's very difficult, maybe impossible currently, to predict with any sort of accuracy who's going to respond and how long is it really going to take them, right? You can make guesses, but how, the forecasting of that is not highly accurate at this point. And so, and that comes back to the idea that we just don't understand the mechanisms well enough. And that's really what was behind this idea of these force-based manipulation networks, that we realized we needed to get people together from different disciplines with different perspectives on what was going on. And essentially, I don't want to call it a shotgun marriage, but we needed to bring these people together in a way that would give us new ideas about how to move the field forward. And that's really where this is all coming from. That's why we're here today.
Dr. Khalsa, I received a private message requesting, you've used the term force-based manipulation, which NIH has used. There are other terms that are being tossed about, such as mechanotherapy, just manual therapy? I mean, what are your thoughts about the description of force-based manipulation? Do you support that, or where did that actually come from?
Yeah. It came from, I think, the recognition that there is a wide spectrum of terms that are used, and some of which really mean different things to different people, some of which are just different words for the same thing. And we also, I think NIH wanted to be agnostic about professions. And certainly as coming from, I was trained as a chiropractor, and even within a given profession, there's sometimes this acrimony about different things. So, and when you get cross professions, you can get even more so. So I think this was a real genuine attempt to come up with some sort of terminology that would be neutral and agnostic about whatever this is. And that's where the term came up. So there was a lot of words that got bandied around for quite a while to come up with this within NIH and specifically within NCCH. And kudos to the program staff who really had to struggle over this for a while. I don't think NIH is anyway trying to limit what people call things, nor is it trying to in any way imply that one phrase or terminology is incorrect or much less wrong, but rather just trying to say, we're open to whatever you want to call it, and just make sure it makes sense. And so that was sort of where I think this phraseology. I think the other thing I'll mention with this is that the other thing, when we were from NIH's perspective, they were talking about how this was, again, because we have, I think, an inadequate understanding of how these mechanisms, the mechanisms actually work, what mechanisms are important, maybe even vital towards a given force-based manipulation, is to recognize that we needed some term that we wanted to make sure that people were understanding that we were trying to describe the therapeutic input rather than saying, oh, well, it's because you've got a force of, 100 newtons or something like that, or you've got a stress of a certain number of kilopascals in a certain region or whatever. It was trying to get beyond the presumed biomechanics and the biological effect of that to focus in on, okay, there is a therapeutic input. We don't know what's actually going on and how it's actually giving any ultimate clinical benefit, but we want to be focusing at least recognizing that that's a key component to it for this type of intervention.
So we probably have enough time for maybe 2 more questions. I think this one should be relatively short. For smaller institutions, what is the best strategy, in your opinion, to be more competitive with larger tier 1 level research institutions that maybe have a strong funding record?
Wow. That's actually, I disagree. I think that's one of the hardest questions. So first of all, NIH, I think if you're from a smaller institution, you're probably aware that the NIH has programs that are only available for small, so-called smaller institutions, small being not in terms of the size of the facilities, but small in terms of extramural grant funding that they acquire. And so there's really literally a dollar amount that's a threshold. And if your institution falls below that, then you're eligible to submit applications to those programs. It doesn't mean those are the only programs you can submit. You can certainly submit to any of the programs, even if you have under that threshold of extramural funding. But that's sort of one thing, is that there are programs, these are congressionally mandated programs, by the way. And so it's not something that NIH can just shut down on its own, even if it wanted to. I think the issue here, and I've had a lot of thought about this over a long time in my own career, is how do institutions that are, we'll just say small for recognizing this as extramural grant funding. but have relatively smaller grant funding on that, how can they compete with the institutions that have a lot bigger, a lot more? And the short story is they can't compete directly head to head. But what they can do is they can collaborate. And I think that's the part of the reason, again, we have these networks. If this particular initiative on the force-based manipulations was all about trying to put together networks of institutions, recognizing that the research-intensive institutions, so-called research-intensive institutions, can bring a lot to bear in terms of from their own institution, both in terms of not just resources, but in terms of people from their own institution who potentially can work together, or from different disciplines. Whereas if you're particularly a professional school, you will probably have very smaller number of resources, as well as faculty members who have different expertise. And so particularly when you're a smaller research institute, it's the collaboration, which I think is how you will sustain any research endeavor. You can go it on your own and you can get grants. And I've seen this happen in many institutions who are small in terms of their extramural grant funding, where they have a rainmaker, as it were, from their institution, who brings in a lot of funding, and then they leave for whatever reason. And all of a sudden now there's nothing there. And the issue is that, again, how do you sustain that kind of thing when you're a smaller institution where you have less numbers of faculty, less resources compared to a large research intensive institution that got lots of faculty, lots of money, endowments, et cetera, et cetera. And I think the only answer, and I think time shows this out, is collaboration. That's how you sustain a research program when you're one of the smaller institutions, and ultimately compete then successfully as well.
I'm glad you said that. That's actually one of the major initiatives of ForceNET, is building that network of collaborators. And we believe that's the real essence of the U24 mechanisms. Well, that was fantastic. That really was pulling back the curtain. I mean, that was the perfect title for this. And this has been recorded, so we will be posting this on our website for all those to see. Thank you, everyone, for participating. Thank you, Dr. Khalsa, and for participating with this and for speaking. Any last words?
I do have a last word, and that is that I saw briefly many people who are on this call who I have had the pleasure and honor of working with over many years, either before I was at NIH or while I was at NIH. And I have a few of them I were able to say hello to at the beginning before the seminar started. But I just wanted to say hello to all of you, and that it has been a great honor in my life to be able to have the distinct excitement and thrill of working with you. And it's good to see you all. And I hope to see you again in some other venue as well.
All right, that very kind statement will end on that. I'll ask the ForceNet folks to stay on. The rest of you, thanks again. You can drop off the call and we'll finish this up.